Hey all, welcome to another episode of the Film Recommendations Vlog. In this episode, we're going to be talking about For All Mankind and Invincible. Why those two? Well, because they are both exclusives to particular streaming services. For All Mankind is exclusive to Apple TV, and Invincible is exclusive to Prime Video. So I thought I would actually cover some stuff that isn't necessarily available to everyone, but might be worth actually going in and at least starting a trial for these particular services if you're so interested. I chose the order simply because it's alphabetical. F comes before I, as many of us know. Anyway, so For All Mankind is kind of an interesting take on the alternative history that you sometimes see in other shows. For example, The Man in the High Castle was a pretty long running. I think it ran for like 3 seasons on Amazon Prime. And that was an alternative history based on a book by Philip K. Dick, if I'm remembering correctly. That was all about how, what if the Nazis and the Japanese had won by the Nazis dropping a nuclear bomb on Washington. And it was also the basis for a popular alternative history sci-fi story called Fatherland, which was made into a very popular film with Rutger Hauer and many others, and I actually have a copy of. But the point is that For All Mankind is not about that. For All Mankind starts in the 1960s and basically asks, well, what if the Russians had beat us to the moon? What if the Russians had beat us to the moon by about a month? And, then what if? So basically a bunch of what ifs start getting asked. And the first season takes place exclusively around the time of the late 60s and early 70s. And what happens is the Americans start getting more and more aggressive in terms of their actions. They decide that they're going to try landing on the moon with Apollo 10 instead of Apollo 11. And then every subsequent Apollo mission is used to try and scout for other resources, basically like water on the moon. And the idea is that if you find some location of water on the moon, then you can have a staging base for further exploration, because then you can use hydrogen-oxygen rockets to, similar to the Saturn V, to send missions further out into space. So you only have to launch it as far as the moon is the idea, and then they can refuel. And this leads to further production of Apollo missions launching every few months, right through the 20s, as in Apollo 23 and 24 and so on. So this basically begins showing like, oh, what if we actually started, what if we actually went full tilt? What if we went further in? So the idea is that, Nixon might have lost the election to Ted Kennedy, and then in turn, all kinds of other further stuff would have happened. Now, you don't actually get a lot of focus on that, oddly enough. You get more of a focus on interpersonal melodrama and a lot of use of top 40 song hits from certain periods of time. And it doesn't quite mesh, unfortunately, because as I was watching the first season, I was, and it's in the middle of its second season right now, but as I was watching the first season, I found myself wondering immediately, okay, so what's going on the Russian side? This is the successful first on the moon space race part, and they've had a string of success with first person in space, first woman in space, first person in orbit, first satellite with Sputnik and all this other stuff. So what would happen, in terms of the Russian side of things? That's something I would actually want to hear about. But we only get brief glimpses of that in the second season, but I'll get to that eventually. So what happens is, eventually water is discovered on the moon, and the Americans decide to modify their Skylab module, which is essentially a modified Apollo module. They decide to modify that into a moon base, and so they add a bunch of other equipment that you would need in a gravity environment rather than a zero gravity environment. Now, this of course leads to all kinds of other issues. For example, the mass production of Apollo modules and whatnot leads to issues in terms of production, so that some parts end up being faulty. One being a particular computer system on one of the Saturn II modules, the smaller rocket modules that actually propel the lunar module and whatnot into orbit around the moon. So basically accelerates the orbital elements, so that instead of taking a lot longer, you end up at the moon in a much quicker amount of time, and then are able to slingshot around. All right, so this leads to all other kinds of issues, and one aspect that I did like was the fact that they actually ended up reviving the women in space aspect to NASA much earlier. So they ended up, as part of Kennedy's re-election bid, having an entire group of women, including some women who were considered for the early Mercury program, brought back and brought into the Apollo missions as a way of, basically having a bit more egalitarianism. That way they could have the first woman on the moon and make that proclamation. So basically, it's an idea of what if the space race never ended with the moon, because the Americans decided to not give up on it. Whereas in our history, the Americans landed on the moon, and the Russians kind of just stayed with in-orbit missions, launching satellites, that kind of thing, but nothing quite as extensive as trying to land on the moon. So what if they landed on the moon, and then the Americans had to basically keep following suit and keep trying to continue the space race? What would that do? Well, the idea that the authors of the show came up with was that this would lead to much stronger advances in overall ability, and it would lead to much more territorialism and much more competition over the limited resources on the moon. It doesn't quite deal with the fact that the moon has several rather severe earthquakes on a regular basis. It still acts. They actually, for all the research that they did on in terms of scarcity and whatnot, they didn't bother including the moonquakes. So I don't know. It's kind of a oversight on their part as writers, but there were other elements, like for example, they try to use stock footage of various news events, various historical figures speaking, such as Ted Kennedy, Nixon, that kind of thing. And for a lot of the Nixon stuff, they really try to do that over audio only, so that they can just have an impressionist do the voice, and then that way it's able to just be carried out over the phone or something like that, and they can maybe do a behind-the-head camera shot of a person with Nixon's general profile from behind in a setting like that, or use actual stock images from that time. Now, as I said, mostly the focus is on this interpersonal melodrama around one person or another, or their marriage or something. And in addition, this leads to a bizarre fascination by the production staff with having the characters smoke and drink heavily on camera. Now, the drinking cuts back as the series progresses, but the smoking doesn't quite as much. And honestly, it informs me a lot about the writers. Like, maybe the writers are people who drink and smoke a lot. And that then informs me a little bit about their politics, because in my experience, The kinds of people who tend to do that very heavily tend to be your libertarians, the people who think that they know what's best for themselves, they're informed about everything, they know everything, and so you can't inform them about this and that. So it informs me that, okay, maybe the writers of For All Mankind are your libertarian types, which makes a certain amount of sense given it's Apple TV, given that it's, given where they're producing from and all that kind of stuff. It just makes a certain amount of sense. Okay, this is where the writers are coming from an intellectual background, from a paradigm, if you will. So their idea is, okay, so we would just keep going with the moon, and we would keep developing projects. And as a pure plot contrivance, sure, there's water on the moon. We'll figure that much out. Even though we've been to the moon several times and we've explored several times and never found ice or anything like that, but whatever. In this universe, there is. So, it enters into a bizarre area when you get so wrapped up in the interpersonal drama that you have very little focus on what's actually going on, and as a result, they end up kind of having to stick in more of the story. And that comes in to be a bit of a problem when you get with the aforementioned top 40s music. The top 40s music sometimes takes over the overall storytelling, so that you might get a montage, then another montage, then another montage, all over this music, and then eventually it'll cut out. And while I can appreciate a good montage, it's like going from one montage to another inside the same episode, and that gets to be a bit annoying. Now, in a lot of bigger production movies and whatnot, where they kind of know what they're doing a little bit better in terms of this stuff, they would have one song for the entire run of a montage. Then they would, if they wanted to have a scene with an interspersion of a line or a bit of dialogue or something that might be important, they would come to that organically. For example, during a solo where there's no lyrics or something, you would dial down the music a little bit and have a little scene of dialogue or importance or something run for about the length of that. Then you would come back in with the music and continue the montage for that little length of time. But they don't do that. So that's where the painfulness comes in a little bit in terms of the storytelling. And it gets to an interesting point with some of the characters, because you have one character named Gordo who is an alcoholic. And he just is there on the moon, and every supply rocket that's sent has to contain a little bit of alcohol for him to parse out so that he can keep from getting the shakes and whatnot. Now, there's actually a bit of real life fact here that conflicts directly with the nature of this story, and that is around the smoking and drinking. They actually had rules for astronauts around this. You were not to smoke. If you smoked, you were to give it up. It's that simple. An astronaut was not to smoke because first off, you can't have cigarettes in space. You can't have cigarettes in a high oxygen environment or even a mixed oxygen environment. Fire is one of the worst things you can have in a space capsule or any kind of space vessel. So, no cigarettes. It also affects your lung capacity, so if there's a shortage of oxygen in the cabin for whatever reason, or if you're running low on oxygen in your suit, and you need to hold it out for a certain amount of time, you have to have the best possible lung capacity that you can. So as a result, no astronauts smoked. And really, it's one of the reasons why a lot of astronauts live so long, is because they were giving up smoking back when everyone else smoked. And it's one of the reasons why they don't age as much, just because they gave up that crap. They aren't taking in a poison. But beyond that, you have the alcohol element. And alcohol also, if you drink too much of it, you can have a foggy head on, for a couple of days after, because the alcohol doesn't necessarily leave your system. So they told the astronauts, it's okay if you want to have a couple of beers, but you have to limit it. You have to limit your alcohol consumption to no more than that, because we need you in control. We need you in your full faculties, and you need to cut that off if you're going into space within like a week or two. So this was a realistic part of the Apollo missions, starting really back with the Mercury program. And it was specifically mandated by persons like Wernher von Braun, who is featured in the first season quite extensively as a character. They really do go full tilt in terms of having certain figures recreate who they are. Certain actors recreate these well-known figures as a way of grounding this in our reality as much as possible, so that we don't feel like this is too far removed from our own reality. And it really does help with the viewer's suspension of disbelief. But with that said, let's move on to Season 2, because Season 2 basically skips over approximately 10 years between seasons. So the idea is that since Ted Kennedy was not as successful, this allowed Reagan to come right in and be elected years earlier than 1980, and then his increase in space and defense funding led to more space shuttles being built than we had under Carter. And the space shuttles were planned even back during the Apollo mission. They started planning more reusable spacecraft that could be used for multiple mission purposes and landed basically like airplanes. This was a plan back when Wernher von Braun was working for the Nazis and came over in Operation Paperclip. This was a huge part of his vision, was a reusable spacecraft that had some kind of air controls that would allow it to land safely from outside the atmosphere into Earth's atmosphere. And this, you can look it up. There are spacecraft that he, envisioned that looked a lot like airplanes as a result. Now, of course, the space shuttle was a much more basic design. But as a direct result of all of this extensive work, the Challenger didn't blow up, and because they were able to catch the low temperature issues with the O-rings on the rockets that were being used for the launch of the space shuttle. And if you're ever interested in that kind of matter, there's a very wonderful film called Challenger that is all about the events leading up to the launch of the Challenger and the explosion shortly thereafter its launch. It's a fascinating story, and you can look into it. It has a great cast. It's well worth watching. Just from that perspective, for some real history on the matter reenacted. But as it is, Reagan's alternative version self, he also had a Department of Defense branch of space exploration that was basically militarizing space, also known as his Star Wars program, if you're familiar with that. So the Star Wars program actually went through, and you ended up having plans for space-based defense platforms, essentially disregarding an earlier treaty that was signed by Russia and the United States that they would not militarize space. So, yeah, the U.S. is quickly becoming this rogue nation in this particular story. But it continues from there, and you get way more melodrama and stuff where it's like, I would not want this as a setting for a United States. But one other aspect to it that they show is that, oh, well, look how much more science has advanced. So you have touch screens on mobile telephones that are like 80s mobile telephones, the big brick ones, but instead it has a touch screen. But it's a monochrome touch screen like on an old Game Boy with the green background and the black LCD crystals. Now, here's a fun fact. I actually went to Kent State where liquid crystal displays, LCDs, were developed. That was where the patent is. That's where all the leading research comes out of. It's the big moneymaker for Kent State. Now, they developed that stuff, and it was it was kind of looked on as nothing for a long time, but because Kent State kept working on the development of it, there was so much more possibility for it, and now it's a standard thing in your smartphone, your laptop computer, and of course your flat screen televisions and monitors. So, go figure that one out. But back to the actual story, you have systems in the space shuttle that are upgraded from what the original space shuttle featured. And essentially technology has advanced more. Now, you could say, oh, well, that's because it got the military funding and it got everything. No, it was actually just because the space industry got more funding. And they were able to develop newer and better technology and implement it and test it in the various ways, so that they could have for example, a smaller size computer operating in a space shuttle, or a system that was more easily upgradable. Because the current space shuttles, the ones that have been going for 40 years now, those have been needing an upgrade in terms of their computer systems for about 40 years, basically, because all of the computer systems that have been used in the current space shuttles are scavenged from old computers from the 1980s, because they can't upgrade them. The requirements and everything. You actually have more computing power in your smartphone than the space shuttle uses. Think about that. But getting away from all that, so they have like direct video conferencing, basically like FaceTime that we have now. Now, the French actually had something like that going as far back as the 1980s, and they implemented something like that, but it had certain technological drawbacks that weren't as advanced as our FaceTime, and so they kind of got lapped on that, and eventually that got phased out as people just started using things like FaceTime and other systems that basically use digital information transfer in order to, rather than over the phone, which didn't quite work as efficiently. But besides all that, they also have all manner of things, more efficient cars, and just basically everything advances a lot more. And a lot of that is simply because the space industry got enough funding so that they could start implementing this stuff. It could become more commonplace as it got produced for other things. And we can honestly thank a lot of technology from the space industry for a lot of things that we have nowadays that are much more commonplace. Everything that you look at that's an advance in a certain facet or other is largely due to that. Now, anyway, the 1980s one doesn't really advance the development much. All that's happened in that time on the moon is there's a larger base where more mining goes on, and you just have crew rotations every so many months or so. And the old Apollo-style lunar landers are still used to get from the moon's surface to Earth. Or not to Earth, but to orbit, where then basically you catch a shuttle, you dock with a shuttle, and then that is what returns you. And it's an interesting use of all of that, and just basically continuous use and gradual updates of the lunar landers in that light. It's an interesting idea. But after a certain point, the basic idea is that nothing happened in that 10 years to speak of. Just, they show you, they have shuttles now, so it's more of a, this is a new element for the story. Instead of Apollo rockets, we're using space shuttles to get from the Earth to the moon. And, there are gradual plans to launch for a mission to Mars to actually beat the Russians at something, and the Russians are encroaching and engaging and becoming more hostile and that kind of thing. But then there are other elements. One of the characters is revealed back in the first season to be a lesbian, and that's controversial. Ooh. And it's like, yeah, it's the 1970s. Yeah, people are going to be squicked out by it, but also, personally, you're telling this story to people who are in the 2000s, and most people in the 2000s aren't going to really care about that. But it's still meant to be kind of a controversial thing because, look at where we were back then, where a lesbian astronaut was controversial somehow. So, all in all, For All Mankind needs to be taken with a pinch of salt because it is coming from a very unique perspective in terms of the author and in terms of its perspective on what would happen. Rather than having basically a reversal of what happened where the Soviets ended up succeeding more and, just like America ended up succeeding more in space in our timeline. In this timeline, they could easily have had a similar thing happen, but they aren't doing that. It gets to be interesting enough in terms of some of the interpersonal drama when it actually has something to do with the plot of the Soviets and the United States involved in its Cold War pursuits and expansion in space. But like I said, it needs to have that avenue explored of what goes on the Russian side of things, because we're still in the middle of the 1980s, and the Stalinist style of operating things only gets you so far. So I'm wondering if this particular show is going to have the fall of the USSR and the Warsaw Pact flipping over to a more capitalist model that's still run by the same oligarchy, or if it's going to be something where the Soviets end up lasting well into the 90s because of other elements. I don't know. But moving on to Invincible. Invincible is an Amazon original, and my immediate thought was to compare it to The Boys. And right away, I can tell you it's better than The Boys. Now, they're still filming The Boys. How many more times can I say that word? But if I can summarize The Boys, it's basically a hate letter to the DC universe with the Justice League, where they just decide, the authors just decide that, if this were run by a private corporation like the Justice League is tied in with Wayne Industries, if this were really done this way, this is what would happen. Well, right away I can tell you that The Boys, if you pay attention and listen to my review of it, you'll find out that, The Boys actually uses a different origin for superpowers, that kind of thing. So it ends up being a different animal altogether from the DC Justice League universe, where everything's kind of developed independently from one another. Instead, all of these figures are tied together. Well, The Boys is such a hate letter to the Justice League that then you look at Invincible, which is very much from the same kind of school where, it's based on the DC model, but it's applying a lot of Marvel stuff in terms of the interpersonal drama of having these abilities, kind of like Peter Parker in Spider-Man, if you follow, where this young guy develops his powers, and he has to contend with working a job, dating a girl, and being a superhero with only so much time in the day. So there's a lot of time management issues in it. But it's a little bit better written than what you would expect, because first off, it's not done with as much vitriol and hatred for the Justice League. It's really trying, and it's not trying to be the Justice League. It's not trying to take all of that stuff that happens in the DC universe and apply it here. It's really just its own thing. Now, that said, the main character of Invincible, who is a character named Mark Grayson, and yes, obviously the Grayson name is a reference to Dick Grayson from Batman. And that kind of stuff keeps happening. Like, there's a character named Nolan in this. But all that aside, he's basically like Superboy. He's basically, a young superhero. His father is a superhero named Omni-Man. And he comes from another planet, only instead of it being that, he comes from another planet and he's the last survivor, his planet is perfectly fine and he came to Earth specifically to save it. But there is a question as to whether or not, there's a question established right in the first couple of episodes as to whether or not that's even a real thing. It gets very gruesome very fast, so it is not for the kiddos. They will be very upset by this. I wouldn't even really recommend it for the teenagers. It has certain problems with that. And when they get into this gruesome stuff with the boys and Invincible, I have to start wondering who these shows are for. But so far, this one is at least enjoyable enough when it doesn't go into that gruesome, gory route. And I don't know why they keep doing it this way, where they could easily cut away, they could film it differently. But it seems like it's so intended to shock the viewers and say, this isn't your Warner Brothers DC animated universe. It's like, yeah, I know it isn't, because I'm not watching a Warner Brothers DC animated universe show. Anyway, so the character of Invincible is interesting because he's an interracial person. So he's half Asian American and half Caucasian. So that gets into an interesting point, but race is not brought up here. Race is not a factor in the actual character, or any of the other characters, for that matter. They don't bring up issues of race. Now, he lives in a suburb, so that might be why, but I can't say. But the interesting element there is that it's a post-racial kind of society where race is an element, but it's also not. Like, you can look at it where it does address race on some levels, but it also doesn't. Other aspects to the show, there are, of course, other superheroes, and there's a lot of questions as to where loyalties lie. So there is a little bit of melodrama and intrigue akin to the Arrowverse shows that you might see. Now, for example, there's basically a team of Teen Titans, but they're differently powered from the Teen Titans that are actually in the DC universe. And so we see a little bit of originality in there. They're a little bit more akin to Marvel superheroes, if you will. For example, one is basically a Gambit type of character where he can throw things after energizing them and make them explode. And he's called Rexplosion or something like that. And then there's another figure who can shrink, a lot like Ant-Man or the Wasp. And then there's another character who can multiply into multiple copies, basically like Multi-Man. Who, again, all of these are Marvel. So there's a little bit of a middle ground here in terms of a lot of it. So you do feel like, okay, this is going into an interesting place. Anyway, so they're led by a robot, and that robot is able to then lead that team and coordinate things, but of course it has to use verbal communication. And anyway, there are some questions as to its loyalties, but there are also questions, of course, as to Omni-Man's loyalties, because it seems like he might be on a different agenda where he might be there representing his race, but also kind of making it so that he's the only superhero and he's the only one who can save them, and his progeny are the only ones who can save them. Meaning, in my mind, I'm just exploring this, and I'm thinking that maybe because his species has these advantages over mortal humans, it'll lead to a breeding program that would eventually see the human race become extinct as they breed more and more with that alien race. I think they're called Valtraxians or something like that. But it's an interesting idea. Like, what if the Kryptonians could interbreed with humans, and what if they used that whenever they went out into space in order to take over a planet, basically, after so much time, by first coming in as a hero and then saying, oh, well, look, we can make you into an entire planet of heroes if you'll just surrender over to us, and we'll have couplings with you, and you'll all have super children, and we'll implement a better way of life or something like that. So that's where I'm thinking this particular story is going. The series is only so many weeks in, but they have a number of episodes already out at this point, as of early April 2021. But with that said, like I said, neither of these series are especially for kiddos. They're more for adults. At best, they're for college age, but honestly, For All Mankind, I don't think is very much for anyone. It just seems like it's miserable, and that's really its problem. It doesn't seem to take any actual joy or satisfaction in life, and everything in the first season is kind of a disaster of the week. Oh, how is something going to go wrong this week? Or what's going to go wrong with this relationship? And it ends up being more of a melodrama at that point that just happens to involve space and have a lot of top 40 music involved. The 1980s setting for season 2 has improved a bit on that storytelling. I actually liked one aspect of the story where the character of Gordo, who we follow, and it's kind of ridiculous that these Apollo astronauts are still involved in the space program, but whatever. But he ends up in really rough shape, still having flashbacks to some upsetting points in time on the moon where they couldn't get back to Earth and were stuck there for months on end. And he finally started going stir crazy and imagining ants were everywhere and seeing little red lights blinking that weren't there. And at one point he was out doing a moonwalk and imagining imagining ants being all over him and wanting to take off his helmet in no atmosphere. So this, of course, had them all worried, and there was a whole thing contrived in order to make that work. But so the thing that I liked about his little character arc was that he was offered a chance to go back into space and go back on the moon, as just part of the missions and whatnot. And this leads to him getting himself in a better place. And I like that. I like to see someone who was down get themselves back into a better place. So he stops drinking, whereas before he actually developed a bit of a paunch from drinking so much. He couldn't run. He couldn't get himself in shape anymore. So he actually started to get himself back into the shape he was in back during the Apollo missions. And it just keeps going from there. He ends up in such a better place for himself that it ends up leading to a real transformation on his part. He even stops, seeing the ants and seeing, worrying about the red lights and having flashbacks and all that kind of thing. So I liked that. By contrast, his wife from season 1, who got brought on as a female astronaut for the other Apollo missions, she's become a bit of a celebrity. They divorced, and she does like photo shoots now, but still goes into space. And then when she goes into space, she realizes that like being on the moon in the moon base is not glamorous, and it's not anything to where you should feel that great about yourself, because basically the moon base is run a lot like a submarine, where it's 24 hours a day, and you have to do what's basically you rotate bed use. So you use the bed, and then when you're not using the bed, someone else is using the bed. So you never get a cool pillow, for example. But the food isn't very good, and she just has to get used to it. Anyway, so it gets to be an interesting thing with all that. But overall, I don't like where they've taken it in the last couple of episodes of this current season, where she's basically like used to it, and now she's still self-satisfied, and she found a way that she can still smoke cigarettes while there. And again, NASA has rules about smoking and astronauts. You are not allowed to smoke if you're an astronaut. This is just a fact. But it's the 1980s, and the writer thinks that they should smoke and drink, so they're going to smoke and drink. No, it doesn't work like that. So, anyway. Getting back to my summary, like I said, I don't think these shows are especially for anyone. Invincible is way more of an enjoyable show in that it actually does work in some comedy elements that aren't just, this person's hurt, ha ha ha, or something like that. Or, this person got gruesomely slain, or something. Because that kind of humor gets tiresome real fast. It's like, okay, we get it. You like Family Guy. You like the shock humor. Well, it's tired. And nobody's that interested in it. By contrast, For All Mankind doesn't have a lot of humor. It has more intrigue in all that. Both shows try and function mostly on intrigue. My big thing is get to a resolution. Get to something that actually resolves all the storylines. Now, when they did that with The Man in the High Castle, you wound up with a pretty satisfying resolution, but it wasn't as satisfying as Fatherland. I thought that the resolution of Fatherland was far better. For those that don't know, I won't bother going into it. You can just watch it. It's an interesting enough story. But in terms of what's going on with Invincible, it is based on a popular comic book series, so you do have that element where they're basically adapting those story elements, and it does work a little bit better than For All Mankind because there are resolutions written in by the authors. It's one of the rules of comic book writing. If you set up something, it has to be resolved. You can't just leave it hanging to never be resolved. It does have to come back at some point. And I'm sure there are going to be comments saying, actually, in this comic book, we never find out about this. I don't care. The point is that if you're doing this in some kind of screenplay or playlet of any kind, you have to have a resolution of some kind set up for the characters, set up for whatever you're doing. Something has to come up that, resolves what was set up earlier. If you set it up and you make a point of it, you have to resolve it. It's called Chekhov's gun. It's something that I really get hung up on when writers don't bother paying attention to that. And this comes after watching all the seasons of Lost. And it's one of the reasons why I didn't get into anything that was going to have a large overarching story for a very long time, because I didn't want to waste my time on it. That's why I never got involved with Game of Thrones, aside from the fact that we didn't have HBO. But I didn't want to watch any of it. I didn't want to get involved with it. I didn't want to bother. I had better things to do with my life. Even with Doctor Who, I stopped bothering with a lot of those overarching storylines and just would watch it just to see what happened. But for me, it's always about episodes and, at best, mini story arcs. Like back with the classic Who, you had mini story arcs that went for a number of episodes, and then that was resolved. In some cases, you would only have 2-parters. In other cases, you would have 3-parters. But it was always resolved within a certain number of episodes so that you could watch it back to back, but that was it. You didn't have this long, season-wide spanning thing that you saw, kind of starting with basically New Who. But as it is, For All Mankind is nothing but overarching story going from one episode to the next, and every episode's a new development in terms of the interpersonal melodrama of these people that we don't really care about and don't even like. Yeah, so that's what you have to deal with. And by contrast, Invincible, you actually have characters that are somewhat likable and you sympathize with, but then by the time you're done, do you really even like them anymore? And that was really the problem with Lost. I didn't really like a lot of the characters that we had in that show. And I was just watching to see how the damn thing ended. But every series that gets into this mystery box crap and, oh, one last thing before you go, we got this mystery we need to introduce. It's like, okay, well, good for you. You introduce your damn mystery, and I'll watch next time. But if you keep up this crap, then, guess what? I'm tuning out. It's actually why I dropped away from watching Arrow for like a season or two, because I just got tired of it. I didn't want to get invested in that crap. And as a result, yeah, I skipped over a bunch of crap with Arrow, and guess what? I don't regret a minute of it, because I ended up having... I had a lot of stuff going on in my life, and I just didn't need to deal with someone else's melodrama when I had my own. But with that said, what would I give these shows thus far, given what I've seen of them? Well, For All Mankind tries to balance its budget for CGI and whatnot with a lot of archival footage that they alter. And then the rest of the time they're trying to do more on-location filming, like on set and whatnot. When I say on location, so real life rather than on a blue screen in a costume, supposedly on the moon or in orbit or something. So the less they do of that, the more that they save budget-wise, because then they don't have to simulate moon gravity or whatever. But in terms of Invincible, since it's animated, they can do basically whatever they want, and they focus more on using 2D animation rather than 3D animation to augment, if you will. And that actually lends a lot more to it, because I've seen so many shows that were 2D animation ruined by having 3D animation kind of shoehorned in. You saw it kind of initially with shows like Futurama, and it worked there because they made it look like it was part of the 2D animation, but also they tried to use it sparingly. It wasn't to show off. So Invincible ends up having really good style elements just with that aspect. So I end up really liking the overall style and storytelling, just in terms of the animation. It works a little bit better. Whereas For All Mankind does really good on the visuals as well, but they know that it's a visually stunning masterpiece on that level. So they know that when they're producing it. So, part of the point of the show is the spectacle in terms of your elements of stagecraft and whatnot. Overall, I feel like they both kind of deserve a 4 out of 5. There are elements that really drag them down, but they're overall pretty good, and that's why I'm even bothering to talk to you about them. If they weren't really worth watching, I would just say these shows aren't very good, here's why, end of discussion. But there's enough there that you could actually get something out of them and enjoy them. But in all, I would not necessarily recommend you get into them until maybe you can watch an entire season in a binge, if you will. Because that'll be way more enjoyable instead of having to watch week to week, as they're doing with a lot of these releases. I think you'll have a lot more fun if you just binge watch a lot of this stuff, and you'll feel better about it. And again, take in mind all of the crap that I noted, so that you know kind of what is going on with that, and to, whether or not to give it any kind of bearing in terms of your enjoyment. I find that the fact that they keep trying to make smoking look sexy in this show is ridiculous, because smoking is not sexy. Drinking is not sexy. Drinking and smoking are not part of sexy, healthy lifestyles. But by contrast, they don't really do that in Invincible. It's not an element. So I feel better about that. I feel like Invincible is at least worth, like if you want to have teenagers watch it, they might enjoy it, but they would have to be older teenagers, like 16 and up, not really anything younger, because it has some problematic elements. But otherwise, yeah, it feels like a little bit more of a solid show than The Boys, which isn't really for anyone. And yeah, they both kind of both For All Mankind and Invincible kind of get a 4 out of 5 from me. So yeah, check them out if you feel so inclined, based on my discussion. I've tried to leave out a lot of stuff so that you'll be able to enjoy them and remain relatively vague so that you won't have too many things spoiled for you. And you'll be able to just kind of enjoy the ride and see where it goes. But as it is, if you want to, leave a constructive and respectful comment below. And by all means, if you want to follow me on Twitter, or I'm also on Facebook. On Facebook, I'm just Claudia. If you're on Twitter, I'm Claudia Reviews. And I also have a Patreon, and I have links on my Twitter account and whatnot as to if you want to support my work. So I would appreciate that very much. I am trying to get into a much more pre-written format where I would then record this as a podcast. So that would be certainly a bit more exciting than here on YouTube, wouldn't it? All right. So anyway, thanks a lot for clicking over and giving a listen. Take care. Bye-bye.